G'day guys, Mac with the Outer Circle, and today's episode, well, this one's completely out of the blue episode, and wasn't in my planned schedule. But, talking about the Flesh Eater Courts the other day, really got me thinking about Age of Sigmar. Because I've speak a lot about how different parts of Age of Sigmar, the factions embody the aspects of old Warhammer Fantasy races. They sort of pick one part of that race, typically, but not all the time. And then they say, alright, let's just take that concept, like, for example, Slayer Dwarves, and let's expand upon that concept. And that's it, that's the faction's identity. And they've done a lot over the last few years to try and build it up a little bit more. Because Sigmar on release is a very different beast to Sigmar now, where in the original sort of releasing of the game, the company just thought they could release it and do no decent lore or background or anything like that, and people would be fine with it. And apart from some admittedly pretty cool miniatures that dropped at the time, people were not cool with it. So, ever since then, it's been this sort of journey to catch up on what sort of Warhammer Fantasy Battles, which is going to become Warhammer the Old World when it gets relaunched after a decade, trying to recapture that sort of magic. And I really wanted to look through and sort of see if they'd done it. So, obviously there's basically 4 factions here, and this means it's going to be probably a decent length of video, so I do apologise. But we've got the Order factions, we have the Destruction, the Death, and of course the Chaos factions. Although I think Destruction, Chaos, they should kind of be swapped around, because I feel like Orcs are more chaotic in that they're random, and Chaos is more destructive. But anyway, let's get into it by starting with Order and with the Stormcast Eternals, which at 71 items by far clocks in as the biggest, most unique faction by a country mile. And they do the job of being a unique faction in the setting of the game. However, I think they are incredibly overrepresented, and they don't do a good job of representing Sigmar if they're going to be so diverse in the amount of different kits they have to perform all of these different roles. It's just so much doubling up on a unit that already exists within the faction to do that role, and seeing it time and time again is not very interesting to me. And when we're seeing things like the sort of the Warhammer Underworlds, essentially, teams, or Warcry teams being imported into these lists as their own sort of thing, it just does nothing for me, because instead of seeing this cohesive army with a lot of units that look like they're wearing the exact same armor and have the same equipment and they feel like a military, instead what we start seeing, especially with these Warcry sets, is we start seeing units that every model's sort of unique in their own way. I mean, there are double-ups of the sculpts to some extent, but they're unique, and their uniqueness makes them look more like characters as opposed to the foot soldiers in an army. And instead they sort of occupy this halfway zone between the two. And really, I think they just need to go through and just cut huge chunks of this faction and the characters away, try and simplify it down to a few key units that sort of define Sigmar better. And frankly, I'd probably start with culling off the original sort of sculpts right down the bottom here. Decimators, Protectors, Retributors, Judicators. I mean, what have we got here? We've got Protectors who are wielding these double-handed spear swords, and Judicators, which are wielding these big Sigmar longbows. And if we go all the way up near the top here, we have Vigilors who are running these big-ass longbows, and Vanquishers who are running the two-handed swords that are practically spears. So, you know, we cover off a lot of the same stuff. And although there's a lot of cool stuff in the Stormcast Eternals range, the Sigmar faction as a whole is very bleh to me. Going on from there, we get Sylvaneth, which I like as a faction, although there is some derpy things in here. The Spite Rider Lancers and Revenant Seekers, the Flying Ghost Bugmen, they do nothing for me. The Gossamed Archers, I think I can kind of understand, But if you're going to have them being spirits, make the wings spirits as well. Don't have them being like these weird insect wing type things. It's struggling with its identity here. Does it want to represent like bugs in nature working with trees and these sort of spirit folk? Or, what does it want to be? And it's can't quite decide, because you have pure tree men in the Kurnoth Hunters, Spirit of Durthu, this sort of thing. Then you've got tree revenants, where it's like, okay, they're not a tree man, they're a tree with a man living in it. And then you've got things like the Dryads, which again are trees and quite old sculpts now. And Dracha, who is now a spirit within a tree. But then you've got the Lady of Vines, who is also a tree. And it can't quite decide, is it tree, is it spirit, is it what? And yeah, but that said, there are some absolutely gorgeous models in this range. I mean, gorgeous models, especially Alariel the Everqueen. Which is really the odd one out here, because although I complain this faction has a weird identity crisis, I mean, Alariel is that dialed up to, not dialed up to 10, not dialed up to 11, dialed up to 15. Because here you have this immortal elf hybrid riding on this giant beetle, bedecked in gemstones and jewels and things like that, and yet we don't see that literally anywhere else in the army. So it's very, very bizarre. If we do see a gemstone, they are very few and far between and pretty much reserved for a couple of these key characters. But none of them are an elf. They're all spirits. So I think it's a pretty gorgeous looking range, but again, Identity Crisis 101. Then we get to the Seraphon, which pretty recently got updated, and I think the Seraphon, yeah, they got this right. This is pretty much a perfect range with no identity crisis, which is great. Really nice to see, and I think they sell it well. So yeah, I think this is a range that they did really, really right. Which is interesting, because really, it's just an old Warhammer Fantasy Battles range ported over to Age of Sigmar and given new sculpts. Again, I still don't like things like the Warcry warbands being included into this. I mean, I get it, Sigmar is a skirmish level game, but the Warcry and Underworld's warbands, they don't feel right to me personally. They're too individual to be a unit, too much of a unit to be a hero. Just my personal take on them, and I hope I don't have to say it too many times. But yeah, they did this really well. Like, all of the resculpts, like Lord Croak is gorgeous. The new Slan Starmaster is basically perfect. I would happily run so many of these redone units in Warhammer Fantasy Battles. Agrodon Lancers, yep, they're perfect reimagining of something like the Cold One Knights. Same as the Spawn of Chotek. Yep, that's a Salamander. So I think they did a brilliant job all throughout this range, and yep, complete kudos to them. Going on from there, the Lumineth Realm Lords, the not high elves of the setting, which have a lot of weird things going on, such as this is the first time out that we're really seeing bowstrings. Usually we don't see bowstrings. That's just some weird little quirk of the sculpts I noticed. It's not good, it's not bad, it's just, it is what it is. And that's entirely to show they have these 3 strings becoming 1 string bow, which is kind of like a Yumi, but not. I'm not quite sure, but it's weird. Anyway, as a faction goes, they have a unique and clear identity. They know what they want to be, and I appreciate that. It feels to me like this is... Well, we're going to get to the Adoneth Deepkin, but this feels like Games Workshop evaluating what went wrong with the Adoneth Deepkin and then trying to fix it in this faction. And I think that's kind of funny, because that's pretty much what this faction is in the lore, in the universe itself, is Teclis deciding that there were things wrong with the Adoneth Deepkin and trying to fix it. But what you have is an army who has unique units. There's very little that I would even think of as coming close to being a double up, and it's a decent sized faction as well. 27 items in here. Yes, there's quite a few independent models, like single characters and such, but on the whole, they've got cavalry units, they've got infantry units, they've got elite infantry units, they've got some war machines, like bolt throwers and monsters, and yeah, I like it. I think they did a good job here. Eventually, the original release where this was half as many models, yeah, that was just slimy. Then we get to the Caradon Overlords, which, although they have a consistent theme, they don't fit into the world of Age of Sigmar. Age of Sigmar is this super high fantasy where you take many of the elements of Warhammer Fantasy and you dial them up to 11. So everyone is fighting in a medieval world, but they have space magic and weapons imbued with space magic. So to have a faction that is essentially steampunk dwarves is a very odd choice, because I get what they're going for. They're taking things like dwarven war machines and the gyrocopter in old Warhammer Fantasy battles and turning that into a faction. And yes, whilst that is a theme, I don't think it's a strong enough theme, especially in this universe, and amplified when they tell you that the power source is Urgold. That there is just this, and that this is the only faction that seems to be really good at being able to do anything with that Urgold, as in technologically speaking. It just is all over the shop. It's a very small range as well. I don't think it's a very interesting range either, which hurts. And something else needed to be done with it. I think what this faction really needs to go to that next level is probably war machines that aren't just blimps. I think if you're going to go down the gyrocopter route, well, for a start, give them gyrocopters. Don't just have these blokes with balloons on their backs, the whalers on the moon, carrying their harpoons. Actually go for the old-fashioned gyrocopter, something with propeller blades. And on top of that, I think give them war machines like the old dwarf steam cannon. Was it steam cannon? I think it was steam cannon. They were flame cannon. Flame cannon. The old dwarf flame cannon, the organ gun, weapons like that. Bring in a Sigmarized version of that. Actually build out the faction a little bit and make them a little bit more menacing. And I think perhaps a really strong melee unit, like you've got the Arcanaut Company, which is almost like an old school Warhammer Fantasy Dwarf Pirates force. No, I think you need an actual hard-hitting melee unit here that justifies taking along these big flying blimps, something that they can jump out of and get into battle, kind of like the older 40k Dark Eldar Raiders were. These light skimmer platforms that these dudes rappel out into battle. Something like that, maybe think Dwarf Hammerers or Iron Breakers, because they're very technological as far as old Warhammer Fantasy Dwarves went. Like, update that into this race, and I think then you'll be onto something as a faction. Then the Adonath Deepkin, which in another universe, these are really cool. But in all of the Warhammer universe, these just don't really work for me. They just don't fit into the world as I personally see it, even in Age of Sigmar with the high fantasy, high magic sort of going on. The fish coming onto land in like etheric waves and whatever doesn't know. And all being blind and soulless, and it's not interesting enough. It's like I wanted to have a Dark Elf Corsairs theme, but couldn't commit to it, so it sort of went for almost zombie pirates from like old Warhammer combined with elven features. It's all sorts of strange. What they should have done was leaned into the sea aspect more, potentially. So a lot of your basic infantry, for example, are just running around with swords and axes. They should be running around with things like harpoons and tridents. They're in the ocean, right? What are the sort of weapons that we think of? Billhooks and, traditional maritime weapons. Go all out if you're going to do it, Load them up with weapons that look like they could have come off a 16th, 17th century sailing ship. Go to town with it in that regard. And again, war gear and warships, like maybe a boat, and I'm not talking about the ghost terrain boat. I mean an actual boat. Why can't you have boats in this faction? If you're able to swim your fish through magical waters that surround and pervade the air, surely you can sail a ship on them. So include some sort of boats in this force. Dare I say, this should be the Waterworld faction. Mad Max on the water. But as it stands, it has no identity. I mean, yeah, it's all painted to look the same, but really it has no identity. It's just a collection of cool-ish looking stuff, and I think it lets it down. Then we get to the Fire Slayers, which are a pretty cool faction. They clearly have an identity. They're clearly inspired by old world Dwarf Slayers, and they're grossly and criminally undersized for what they need to be. They need to have, for those who remember, in the Storm of Chaos at the tail end of 6th edition, early 7th edition, I think it was, Warhammer Fantasy, there was the Storm of Chaos book, and in there it introduced the Dwarf Slayer list. And the Dwarf Slayer list gave you rules for fielding purely Dwarf Slayer armies, which is cool. That's what this faction needs. It doesn't need more characters riding on giant monsters. I think that's one of the big cliches of Age of Sigmar that just needs to go. Maybe bring back the Slayer King of Karak Kadrin. That might not be a bad choice. Like, bring an actual proper old school special character into this faction, and no, Gotrek Gurnison does not count. Bring back the High King of the Slayers. Actually put some characters into here, some named characters, and give them things like the Goblin Hewer, which was essentially a belt or chain-fed dwarven war machine which threw axes instead of like a trebuchet or a bolt thrower. It threw axes, and it was really cool. It was a Slayer unique army thing. Yeah, bring that sort of thing back into this faction. Again, like the Caradon Overlords, it's such a small faction. Give them some war machines. Give them some equipment that would actually suit them. And I'd also like to see something to do with the blacksmithing aspect, because this faction, you've got the Hearthguard, who have these sort of flamethrower type weapons meets halberds. That's the Auric Hearthguard. Then the Hearthguard Berserkers have these sort of flails, fire flails on little halberds, which is weird. And then you've got your regular sort of Fire Slayers. What they need something like the Grimhold Exile. A unit that's armed with like hammers, like a blacksmithing unit. Think the old Anvil of Doom, and as if you had an Anvil of Doom and its bodyguard. And maybe even bring back the Anvil of Doom. You've got the Magmic Battleforge. It would be awesome to include an Anvil of Doom in here. If you're not going to bring the Anvil of Doom back in another thing, and Cities of Sigmar does not count, do it here. This is the appropriate place to do it. And I think that would look really, really cool. Forging the runes, to go into the get embedded into the skin of these guys. That'd be so cool. Then we get to the Daughters of Cain, which is a really cool little faction, and I can tell exactly what it's trying to be. And I appreciate that. So, what is it lacking? It's lacking something. It's got the big blood-racked shrine and the Queen on the Cauldron of Blood. I think it needs a more traditional chariot. Maybe something pulled by like 3 dark steeds with sort of similar to the Slaneshi chariots. Maybe even a wink and a nod to Slanesh, like, hey, this is kind of how you started. A set of chariots with like a couple of Cainite witches hanging off the chariots. Something like that's needed. Because the Doomfire Warlocks is a bunch of blokes on horses, let's be honest. It's not quite the same when it's called the Daughters of Cain. So a bunch of witch elves on the side of a chariot hanging off it would be really cool. Maybe an alternate build where it's something like the Melusai Bloodstalkers are on the chariot, firing arrows off it. Something like that. And that's probably all this faction needs. I don't think they need a war machine as such, like the old bolt thrower. I think their Bloodrack Shrine and the Cauldron of Blood and that, those are all perfectly acceptable war machines for this faction. And yep, they've got Marathi. They don't need any crazy big special characters or anything. They got one. They got one, and it's great. And I don't think it needs to be anything more extensive than that. And I don't think it needs many more troops. So probably that twin sort of chariot thing, and I would call this faction done. And then lastly, we get to the cities of Sigmar. And I am not going to include old school Warhammer Fantasy in here because that is a pathetic afterthought. No, this faction is from the Alchemite Warforger onwards, and it's really just 11 things. Is there a theme here? Oh, I'm not quite sure. It's like Bretonnian men-at-arms in the city of Mordheim, is what it feels like. And it's a low fantasy human race, almost, in the high fantasy setting of Age of Sigmar. It feels a little quaint. Like, again, this is very human technology, like black powder and gun barrels and cannonballs, which you contrast that with something like the Caradon Overlords, who are using magical gold to power giant steampunk airships. And these things exist in the same setting. I think you could get away with dwarf gyrocopters existing in the same world as Khemri in old Warhammer Fantasy, but that's because the crazy fantasy elements weren't so far deviated from the real world. It was just a mechanism to make the universe work. Here, the universe depends on the mechanism at every level to work. And the Cities of Sigmar stuff, again, I think, like the Adontic Deepkin, really work in another game that's not this game as implemented. But, to their credit, they have a broad enough for a first release faction. They've got more units than many other forces got in their first release, so they've really doubled down and gone, we want to build a faction out of this. But it feels thin on the ground. It feels like it's lacking something, and I can't quite put my finger on it. I don't dislike the sculpts or anything like that. I think that's all fine. It feels really, really odd in the world in which it's trying to exist. Something feels off about it, and I can't quite put my finger on it. Maybe this faction does need some of this old Warhammer Fantasy stuff, like the Luminarch and the Celestial Hurricanum. Bring them into this faction, maybe, as separate war machines to add some more magic to the setting, to the faction, sorry, because, yeah, as this faction looks, something's not quite right. Anyway, that takes us through order, so let's move on. Because I think overall, order is moderately good. There's probably 3 factions that are really good in there. By far and away, the old school Wizardmen are the best faction in order. So, yeah. Let's see if Death can top that. So, the Soulblight Gravelords, which is the generic undead faction, is just a bloated mess of whatever is floating around from Warcry, from Underworlds, from what was that bloody Cursed City, and it's just all been thrown in together. There's a mixed match of scales, there's old models from old Warhammer, there's brand new models from this edition, and it is an absolute mess because of it. And it doesn't fully know what it wants to be. I think there's a lot of potential in here. I think what it really needs, Soulblight Gravelords, this is just a generic vampire faction. And they've just thrown a bunch of these weird vampire sculpts all into it. Again, scale be damned. And that's not right. I think it needs to bring back something like those old school vampire bloodlines. And really, Soulblight Gravelords, as it's implemented here, make it vanish. Because this is awful. What there should be is like it should be like the Flesh Eater Courts. Break it down into each type of vampire. have their own little niche sub-faction. And if you insist on doing Soulblight Grave Wards as this, make it Necromancer focused. Okay, keep the vampires in as their own thing. Go really heavy on the Necromancer route. I think that would be stronger as a theme. So maybe the bats, the vampires, the blood knights, things like that, they go their own way as a vampire faction. But like the zombies and the crypt ghoul, not crypt ghouls, the graveguard zombies, corpse carts, put all that into its own thing, right? So it's like, this is the newly raised dead. Make that its own thing. And all these vampire heroes, like, downsize them, cut them away, I don't know what. The vampires, the Vargeist, the Blood Knights, the bats, the vampires on zombie dragons, take that all, put it into its own faction. That's where they belong. And the Mortis engine belongs in Nighthaunt. Get it out of here. The Mortarks, I can see them used here. I think the Mortarks, they all belong in the Bone Reapers. So does Nagash. He doesn't belong in this faction. I know it sounds crazy, but he's the head of all undead, not this form of undead, I don't feel. So get him out of it. This very much should be focused on necromancy and, like I say, the newly raised dead. Make the vampire bloodlines their own thing again, or have them being something that, you either take the basic necromancer style of this army and then you can add flavor by choosing, like, you take blood dragons, now you get access to the blood knights. You take Von Carsteins, maybe you get access to all like these crazy Radakar the Wolf and, all of that sort of thing, like the more generic Dracula type stuff, I don't know, and the werewolf type stuff. They can be the flavor that you add on top of the faction, as opposed to just being all throughout it. Now, skeletons and zombies should be the basic theme, and necromancers. What a mess. Then we get to the Flesh Eater Courts, which I think are really, really solid. One of the better factions in Age of Sigmar. And all of the units that are in here make sense to me. So that should be sort of the first clue that something has gone very, very right. Because there is none of that, what the hell is this? What scale is going on here? Anything like that. Maybe the Royal Beast Flayers here. Again, it's a Warcry thing. Yeah, they probably don't belong in there. But everything else, good, perfect. It's a clear, simple faction with a coherent theme. Ghoulish zombies tearing at flesh. They're all living, sort of. Except for, like, the zombie dragons and stuff. But that's fine. That's fine. This is a really good faction. Then we get to Nighthaunt, one of the best factions in Age of Sigmar, and I will die on that hill. Because you have such a small little thing, which is banshees, like ghost swarms, and wraiths, and maybe hex wraiths, were units that were in the original Warhammer Fantasy. And they took that and they actually made it into an entire faction, which is all about almost purgatory, I guess you could say. And it works really, really well. And every unit has a job, and every unit is unique. Yes, you have the elite sword-wielding dudes who are really, really good at cutting up units, but you don't get a lot of them. They're kind of fragile. You've got the former medic apothecary women who prevented people from dying, and as punishment for preventing people from dying, and therefore their souls not going to Nagash, Nagash has punished them with unending torment as harbingers of death, basically, with their healing hands replaced with scythes. What a great little, what a great little thing. The fact that it's just this cool, undead, ghostly force, and the weirdest models in the range are Reikenor, because of the winged steed, and not the Cruel Cast. It's the bloke with the tome. He's the odd one out. Yeah, this guy, the Scriptor Mortis. Just having that third arm and this rib cage and bones holding up his book. Yeah, no. That doesn't suit this faction one bit. Because everyone else, he needed just a stone pillar that his book sat on. Or maybe like old rotted wood, the way that you see different characters have like the... you've got the broken apart piece of boat here, or like the Drowner has. That's what he needed, not the silly bone thing. This bone sculpture looks like something out of the Ossiarch Bone Reapers, not Nighthaunt. Nighthaunt doesn't do that. So definitely the weakest model in the faction by a country mile. And again, why has he got 3 arms? Nobody else does. It's so strange. And also home to some of the most gorgeous models in Age of Sigmar. Kurdos Valentian, the Craven King on the throne. Lady Alinda, Mortarch of Grief. I really also like the Mirmorn Banshees. Obviously the Glaive Wraith Stalkers look really cool. Just, what a great faction. Although the Hex Wraiths, nowhere near as good as the rest of the faction, because they are just lazily ported over old world models. Same with the Tomb Banshee and the Can Wraith. They're not quite as good as the rest of the faction. Funny enough, the Spirit Hosts work. Probably in the running for strongest faction in Age of Sigmar, thematically. Then we have the Ossiarch Bone Reapers, which this should be the Nagash faction. The styling of this faction, the armor and color palette, the bone theme, it's the same as Nagash, it's the same as the Mortarchs, and they show it by having things like the Morghasts in here, which first dropped in the end times of Warhammer Fantasy Battles. That theme, these guys were personal bodyguards of Nagash. So having them in this faction and the whole faction looking like them really says this is a Nagash faction. And it should probably be written as more the Nagash faction and modified as such because they look like him. It should be the elite force of purpose-created dead that serve him. And all the other undead are just tangential to that. He claims ownership of them, but this is his baby. And it was really strong in Sigmar version 2. This was a ridiculously broken strong faction. Still strong now, but very different. Yeah, I do like the fact that there is a coherent theme going throughout, but there's a lot of goofiness in the sculpts here. The Bonecast Eternals, I think, is the best name for them. Because essentially it's Stormcast Eternals fluff. It's just you're imbuing bones with souls as opposed to imbuing or reincarnating long dead warriors in golden armor. Same thing, right? These Necropolis Stalkers, weakest sculpt in the faction by a mile. Silly having the 4 arms, giant twin sword. No, they don't look right. The old Ushabti of Khemri, 10 times cooler, 10 times better looking. The Mortisan Soulmason on his little bone leg construct, I don't know if he needed it. Maybe it would have been cooler instead of 2 legs if it had a ton of legs like the Mortek Crawler does. Would be creepier and suit better. The Gothazar Harvester, I'm pretty weak sculpt as well, I think, personally. But overall, coherent theme, just needs that identity, I think, of being the Nagash faction, because visually, perfectly tied in. So Death, on the whole, half of it's fantastic, half of it is an identity crisis, I think. For Ossiarch, it's mostly an identity crisis in background. For Soulblight Gravelords, it's just a dumping ground for everything undead, and it shows. That range needs fixing. Anyway, let's go on from here to maybe Destruction. So, yeah, Destruction. Well, let's start with the Auric War Clans, which, like Soulblight Gravelords, are a dumping ground for everything green. And This seems to be a repeating pattern. City of Sigmar was a dumping ground for everything left over from the old Warhammer, and this is a dumping ground for destruction for everything left over from old Warhammer, and I think we'll probably find the same is true again with Chaos. So what's going on here? Well, we're trying to combine essentially Black Orcs, Hobgoblins, and Savage Orcs into a faction, and it doesn't work in Sigmar. Savage Orcs and regular Orcs worked in Warhammer Fantasy. Here, Savage Orcs need to be their own thing, I think. And that's a great little range to expand upon. You can have Savage Orcs with a Savage Troll, or Savage Trolls, something like that, or Savage Gargants. That would be a cool little theme. And there's a lot you could do there, going very much with Boars and Orcs. On the other hand, you've got these gigantic Gore Grunters and more Grunter Tusk Boss, whatever you want to call them. Like these giant super boars with Black Orcs on them. And you want... I don't know. All of the models are cool looking. Okay, maybe these Weird Brute Wreckers... They embody something I've noticed in a lot of units lately, which is they've got pants, they don't have shirts. But it's not even like they have pants, they've got like armor that comes halfway up the torso and then stops. There are Chaos models like that, especially in the Khorne range. Maybe I'll remember to point them out. And they're in the 40k Khorne range as well. You see a lot of this where it's like, oh, they're berserkers, so they don't wear armor except where they do. I don't get it. Yeah, Savage Orcs, Orc Boar Boys, and obviously the Cruel Boys, Hobgoblin sort of stuff. Like, why is this all a faction? Like, is it just because it's a collection of greenskins? But it doesn't feel right. It feels like some of this stuff is like the elite of the elite, right? Look at the Mega Boss. And then just have that picture in your mind of this big, hulking, very green, very traditional orc, armoured brute. And then you look at something like, I don't know, Hobgrot Slitters. And they're in this almost sort of Asian steppe armour, in a way. I don't know. I'll zoom in on the models. Because it doesn't look right. It's a completely different armour scheme. And how is this the same faction? No, I can't buy into it. Old school Warhammer Fantasy Battles managed to make goblins, night goblins, orcs, and savage orcs all fit into one faction really, really well. Because, well, the forest goblins had little like wooden shields and spears that looked the same, just smaller than what the orc boys had. Okay, I can sense a coherent thing going on here. They're painted in the same tones of green. And the greens got darker and deeper as the model got bigger because that was how the orcs are written. Here you've got like these weird yellowy skins, then you've got these really desaturated greens and giant vultures and stuff. Like, none of that makes sense to me. And these really like rich greens in the savage orcs, and then these yellowed beiged grey greens on the mega bosses. So instead of being like the old black orcs, where it's this real deep, that Dark Angel's armor, Dark Angel's green, symbolizing they're the biggest, the greenest, the baddest. They are the black orcs. No, that's just gone. It's so bizarre. Just a dumping ground. No faction identity. Needs to be ripped into sub-factions. Hate it. Alright, the Ogre More tribes, which are... Yeah, this is... it's another one with a really coherent theme. Because it's pretty much entirely Age of Sigmar 1.0. Units that were there in Age of Sigmar 1.0 because they were brought over from Warhammer Fantasy Battles. This is Warhammer Fantasy Battles as a faction. The only thing that looks a bit odd now is, well, it's the Noblars. See, Noblars in old Warhammer Fantasy Battles made sense because they'd fled from Chaos Dwarf enslavement in the Far East and basically took up with ogres to use the ogres as protection. They're happy to do all the horrible jobs for the ogres, and the ogres protect them from their enemies. saviors, basically, in the saddest of ways. That works in old Warhammer Fantasy battles, but that threat isn't quite the same in Age of Sigmar. So it doesn't work in Age of Sigmar, especially when everything else green was just thrown into one faction. What are these guys doing here? It just seems like they were there in the original game. They should be there in this one. And yeah. But on the whole, the models are good. So many of these sculpts have held up so well over the decades. And I mean decades. These are 20-year-old sculpts in most cases. The faction's in a good place. Then we've got the Gloomspite Gits, which is a ludicrous faction with a lot of dumb things going on, but it suits them. That's a clear and present theme. What doesn't suit is things like the Snarlfang Riders, where they've got that more traditional mean goblin look, where, you know, these aren't a humorous little character you can poke fun at. These guys are evil, cunning, and conniving. And you turn your back on them, they will just start stabbing you repeatedly in that back. Can't trust them. And they look it. They've got mean-looking wolves, and this is in the same faction as you have a dude tweaking out on mushrooms. Pick a theme. Like, you know, one dude's turned into a spider, another one is on a bad high. One dude is exploding under his experiments. Like, there's all sorts of crazy things going on. One dude's vaped so much because he didn't wear his mask and he was cooking meth with Walter White. And you've got all these crazy squigs jumping around with dudes with giant hats on them, gleefully evil. Then to go to like snarling just mean wolves. I don't know. It just seems a little bit odd, we'll say. Especially when you look at some of these other goblins and such. I think you can get away with like the Arachnarok and stuff. Although that's more of a forest spider than a tunnel spider, if there's such a thing. Yeah, it's got a theme, it's got identity, but it's this guy's old head's turned into a mushroom. Same faction, people. Yeah, maybe a little bit trimming around the edges of this range, but I think it's pretty solid. And then the Sons of Bahamut, which is not a real faction, let's be honest. It's a cool theme, giants, but translating that to an effective tabletop army that suits all the other tabletop armies in balance, and beyond the fact that they're big, especially when they're all in the same pose. Like, okay, you can change some of the accessories like the belt buckles, and okay, which weapons have they got? But they're the same left leg stepping forward pose on every one of them, and unfortunately, you notice it. Same with the Man Crusher mob, and this is also a very expensive army to get into. Like 3 of these guys to make an army list, and that's going to be over 1,000 Australian dollars for plastic. I don't care how big it is. It's a ridiculous joke of a faction. They shouldn't be their own thing. Maybe just add them into ogres or into orcs, one or the other, as their own separate thing. I don't think it works. So I would say on the whole, Destruction is an awful place, with ogres being the standout, just because it's old Warhammer Fantasy and it has a coherent theme because they didn't really touch it, which is kind of sad. Gloomspite Gits, they're close, but they need to trim around the edges just to cut away a few units that don't look quite right with what this faction's trying to look like. You're either crazy maniacs on magic mushrooms coming off a bad acid trip, or you're evil, cunning, conniving, backstabbing, and just mean at heart. And you can't be both. You can't be comically inept and mean at the same time with this faction. It doesn't work. Pick one, as I like to say. And then lastly, that takes us to Chaos as a faction and Slaves to Darkness, which is the obligatory dumping ground. The dumping ground for everything Chaos, especially if it's a Warcry or an Underworld's warband, or anything from any other god. Just dump it in here. You know what though? It's still mostly cohesive, and you know, at least dumping Warcry warbands into Chaos kind of semi makes sense, because it's meant to be all these tribes being united together who have different aspects all united together as one. But this is not the unity of old Warhammer Fantasy battles, where it's like Viking tribes being and Huns and Mongols all being united together, the enemies of the civilized world, and being united by a conqueror every so often. These factions are united under Archaon, and have been since the dawn of Age of Sigmar, basically. So why is there so much divergence over the hundreds and thousands of years, when it should be becoming more and more homogenous over time and more intermingled? That doesn't make sense to me on a storytelling level, but anyway, I digress. The Chaos Warrior stuff is fantastic, and it looks like it belongs together. The Maraudery looking stuff, this is weaker. Because the Chaos guys look almost like, well, it looks like the Chaos Space Marines next to the Loyalist Space Marines. You have the golden armored guys, and here you've got the black armored guys. These guys have gold as accents, the other guys have blue as accents. Okay, they're like a dark mirror of one another. That all works. It's when they step away from that that doesn't, because now you go from these big hulking knights in spiked evil armor to, here's a bunch of juggalo weirdos. I don't know. Dumping ground factions are my least favourite thing about Age of Sigmar, bar none. You got 20-year-old Chaos Marauders and Chaos Spawn existing in the same world as, brand new Warcry warbands and Chaotic Beasts and stuff. It's Identity Crisis 101. Yeah. Trim. That's all I can say. Then we have the Beasts of Chaos, which is... It's not a dumping ground like the other form of Chaos. This at least has a coherent theme, and that theme, of course, is Beastmen. So I actually would have to say, on the whole, yeah, actually really good. But hardly touched. So I think I can see a sort of theme occurring here, which is everything that was its own faction in old Warhammer Fantasy battles and built that way from the ground up has very much carried that through. And it's the factions where they've added a lot of new stuff mixed in with old models that seem to be some of the worst factions. Yeah, no, I would say that the Beasts of Chaos actually look really homogenous as a faction. So, yeah, kudos to them. Alright, what about the Blades of Khorne? So, again, same thing. Apart from these sort of Warcry carryovers, which, Cause of Karanak, cool, buddy. No, the Fleshhounds and all these different Slaughter Priests and such, they all work really, really well. Skull Reapers, see, here's more of that. We're talking about where they've got armored pants and a little bit of their torso, but then they're bare on the upper half. And Wrathmongers take that to 11. You've gone to the point of having armor all the way up your chest, but you won't do the shoulders. Whatever. No, there's a really coherent theme here, which is great to see. You've just got a few odd quirks in here, like Silent Angriffin. What the hell is that? Some guys are going completely armorless, which I think works for some berserkers, but then other guys are in really heavy plate armor, like traditional Warriors of Chaos. Not quite sure what they're getting at there. So, yeah, I think it works pretty well. Then we have the Disciples of Tzeentch, which, again, pretty coherent theme. I don't know why you need a Zangor upgrade pack with chainswords and lasguns in Age of Sigmar, but hell, lasguns are probably pretty potent, so maybe you do need those. Yep, Curseling, cool. Looks good. Again, another faction which mostly unchanged from old Warhammer Fantasy battles, with the exception of adding Zangors. and the Ogred Tower Mage. Yeah. Don't know why the old Chaos Spawn are in here. I guess because they're mutated. They could just go in with this, the mutating faction. But, I mean, they exist in the same faction as Moonface here. Whatever. Yep, another clear theme. Solid going throughout. Especially the chainswords and lasguns. That really is good. Alright, Hidden Knights of Slaanesh. Which, again, solid, consistent theme throughout. Looks gorgeous. I just wish that the Slangors had a bit more going on. We had more than just these sort of 3 sculpts. Give us more sculpts. Give us more options with them. Not just the same 3 bodies over and over. It can be done. But yeah. I know what this faction wants to be. Clearly looking at it, every unit has its own place. And it's good to see Slaanesh finally filled out. It took so long. Never has Slaanesh been anywhere near as filled out as the other Chaos Forces have been. So to actually see it happen is... what a time to be alive. It's so great. Nurgle, the Maggotkin of Nurgle, same thing. Apart from, like, you know, your Warcry carryovers. I mean, it's not as bad here, because it's not just every Warcry warband, but again, they look like a bunch of unique heroes on a quest. Then again, so do the Putrid Blight Kings, and I really like those models. So I had a lot of fun painting those models. But this faction is carried over pretty well. I still think the Gotkin, even though I have one, is pretty dumb. And I don't really like the Ogret's Demon Spew and the other Bloat Rot Spawned and Mordebeck's Twice Born. They're kind of dumb. But all the rest of the range is really, really good. That's just my personal taste. I don't particularly love those models compared to the other ones around them. Things like this Harbinger of Decay and Original Epidemius, they're just gorgeous. Festus the Leech Lord, such character to him. Yeah, no, every one of the gods has done it. They've done a great job, you know, and you can see why regular Chaos is just the dumping ground. And then lastly, the Skaven. Skaven Macker. I know, but you don't like it when I say Skaven. Yep, they've got a homogenous theme because they are practically untouched in every sense of the word from old Warhammer Fantasy Battles. So yeah, if you were to keep with the themes of Age of Sigmar, you maybe should break the Plague Censer Bearers and the Plague Monks off into their own faction. And if I was going to do something with the Skaven, I would move them away from Chaos. I would probably put them into a Destruction faction. No matter how much they want to tout the Horned Rat as a Chaos God, I think it's more of a Destruction God out for itself. And I would try and do something like taking Warlock Engineers and things like the Storm Fiends, making that its own faction. In fact, thinking about the Thanquol and Bone Ripper and the Storm Fiends and how they were introduced in the end times, when I look at them, I really do think that that was the first sort of Age of Sigmarizing of the faction, where it's like they took something, which is like Rat Ogres and Warlock Engineers, and then dialed it up to 11 or 12, because they are kind of different to the rest of the faction, aren't they? And it's almost like that's like taking an idea and expanding on it. And I feel like Skaven could almost be broken into 2 halves. Your traditional rats, and your Warlock Engineers type stuff. You know, like Clan Moulder and the Assassin stuff on one end, and all the Warlock Engineers and Clan Pestilens maybe on the other. Might be the way to break it up. Where you've got like Plague Monks and stuff combined with like Warpstone imbued horrors and Warpstone weaponry, which the Plague Monks can be around because they're immune to it. Something like that. And obviously like the Assassins running around with teams of Storm Vermin and jumping out, shivering someone, then jumping back into Storm Vermin. Something like that's what it needs, I think. But the Skaven, yeah, there's definitely a faction here with a homogenous theme, but something needs to be done to break them up. And really, that's it. That takes us through the entire Age of Sigmar factions. And how did we go? Well, the ones that were not touched from old school Warhammer Fantasy, because they were really well thought out in Warhammer Fantasy and very homogenous, that worked in their favour in Age of Sigmar, I think, really well. The new factions that have come along are a real mixed bag. The strongest of them have that consistent theme, and they've gone out of their way, like with a Nighthorn or Flesh Eater Courts, to write a compelling story for them. The ones where they've just sort of said, stuff it, they're here because magic, like a Caradon Overlords or a Lumineth, not a Lumineth, Edoneth Deepkin, those kind of factions are a lot less interesting, compelling. They need some work still. So yeah, it's still in a really mixed place as a game, and I don't think it's been able to decide yet. Is this a true skirmish battle game, or is this a giant army battles thing? Because big monstrous creatures, I think, work really well in giant army battles. They don't work so well in a skirmish game. Because it's like, here's 10 clan rats and they have to take down a bloodthirster. That doesn't sound great to me. Can be done, but it works better when that bloodthirster is spearing into an army of hundreds of, Empire greatswords or something. That's interesting. And it makes sense gameplay-wise. Here, it's like they want to have all those centerpiece models of old Warhammer Fantasy battles, but they don't want to have rank and file units that you move as a big coherent blob and all the tactics related to it. They want you to be able to move stuff around like you're playing 40k. And in 40k, you've got things like tanks and stuff like that to, offset these giant monsters. But many of the characters in 40k are just normal-sized characters. They're just strong. Like, Abaddon is not the size of Archaon, okay? You have things the size of Dreadnoughts, and maybe something like a Primarch's the size of an old, box Dreadnought in height, but they're still quite small compared to the gigantic characters in Sigmar. And obviously, if they make a gigantic character, it becomes the centerpiece of the army. Everyone wants to take it. They cost 1 million points. They cost $1 million as well, and they've got to have these crazy over-the-top rules to justify their existence. So there's an identity crisis at so many levels going on with Age of Sigmar, and yet there's the soul of a good system in here. So I'm really mixed on how I feel about it. I think no Sigmar 4. Don't bring out Sigmar 4.0. Let's sit on 3 for another 3 years, maybe 4 years. Let it breathe, get some FAQs out, and start to fix these factions. Don't just shoehorn Games Workshop. Every single Warcry kit, every single Underworlds kit, even if they've got cool models, don't just shoehorn them all into these factions, because, again, you all of a sudden have these individual named heroes who are all so unique, and then you're putting them in with groups of homogenous rank-and-file troops on round bases. It's an odd look, and I think it hurts the game. Visually and thematically, maybe not in gameplay terms, but, we're not judging it just on gameplay terms. If we judge it just on gameplay terms, then it's worse, because there are so many factions that just don't work in Age of Sigmar, because there is so... Like, you go up against Stormcast Eternals, they've got 71 units to pick from. You're going in with Caradon Overlords, you can pretty much guarantee that everything in that faction is going into that game, because they haven't got a choice. It's a nightmare. And some factions have such access to characters and rules that just make them so dominant compared to other factions. Yeah, I don't know. There's things that need to be done. But anyway, that's it. Mac with the Outer Circle. Please leave your thoughts on Age of Sigmar below. I don't need to know if you hate it and you want to go play the old world instead. Cool. That doesn't help Sigmar as a topic. If you dislike it and you want to say like why you dislike it, that's a bit different. In which case, please comment away. But other than that, it's been an hour-long episode, so I'm going to see you guys next time.